Death has a way of exposing family secrets. But what I found in Dad's study that morning wasn't just any secret, it was a confession that would tear our perfect family portrait to shreds. I stood there, fingers trembling around the envelope I'd discovered tucked behind his collection of first edition Hemingways. The paper felt delicate, almost fragile, like it might crumble under the weight of its contents. Dad's distinctive scrawl across the front simply read, "For Piper, when the time is right." The study still smelled like him, leather, pipe tobacco, and that fancy cologne Grace had given him last Christmas. Grace. Always Grace. Even now, 3 days after the funeral, I could hear her downstairs, consoling Mom with that practiced tone of sympathy she'd perfected over the years. "I just don't know what we'll do without him," Grace's voice drifted up. "But don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of everything." Of course she would. She always did. I sank into Dad's leather chair, the one where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing contracts while I sat on the floor nearby, pretending to read but really just wanting to be close to him. The letter opened with a soft tear. "My dearest Piper, I've failed you. For years, I've watched you fade into the background while your sister took center stage. I convinced myself it was for the best, that Grace needed the attention more, that you were stronger, more capable of handling the shadows. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong." My throat tightened. Below, Grace's laugh echoed through the house, that perfect, musical sound that had always made heads turn and hearts melt. "There are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago. About the company. About Grace. About why your mother and I made the choices we did. But most importantly, about the trust fund and what really happened to it." The words blurred as tears threatened to spill. I blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. 28 years of being the strong one had taught me that much. Your sister isn't who everyone thinks she is. The night before I changed my will, she came to me with, "Piper? What are you doing in here?" I jumped, crumpling the letter against my chest. Mom stood in the doorway, her face pinched with disapproval. Even in grief, she managed to make me feel like an intruder in my own home. "Just looking through some of Dad's things," I said, sliding the letter into my pocket. "Someone needs to start organizing everything." "Grace is handling that," Mom replied automatically. "She's already contacted the estate lawyer and..." "Of course she has." The words came out sharper than intended. Mom's lips thinned. "I know this is hard for you, dear, but there's no need for that tone. Your sister is trying to help. Like she always does." I stood up, suddenly unable to breathe in the suffocating space. "Has anyone asked what I might want to do? What role I might want to take? Piper, please. This isn't the time for..." "When is the time, Mom? When Grace has already divided up everything? When she's decided what happens to Dad's business? To this house?" The silence that followed was heavy with 28 years of unspoken words. "We're having dinner in an hour," Mom finally said, her voice carefully controlled. "Try to be pleasant. For your sister's sake. She's taking all this very hard." I watched her retreat, then pulled out the letter again. The last paragraph caught my eye. "Remember this, Piper, sometimes the greatest act of love is finally standing up for yourself. When you're ready, look behind the painting in my study, the one of the lighthouse. What you'll find there will change everything. All my love. Dad." I turned toward the painting, my heart pounding. Behind me, Grace's voice floated up again, sweet as honey and twice as thick. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the familiar urge to fade into the background. Instead, I felt something new. Something dangerous. Something like revenge. The lighthouse painting mocked me throughout dinner, its secrets burning a hole in my pocket alongside Dad's letter. Grace had outdone herself with the meal, her signature roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, Dad's favorite. Of course. I was thinking, Grace announced, cutting into her meat with surgical precision, about converting Dad's study into a home office. For the business. My fork clattered against the plate. You're what? Well, someone needs to take over Johnson and Associates. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, the perfect picture of composure. Dad was grooming me for it, after all. The lie sat there between us, bold as brass. Dad had never mentioned grooming Grace for anything except perhaps Olympic-level manipulation. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Mom beamed. Tom would have wanted. Actually, I cut in, Dad left some specific instructions about the company. The letter felt heavy in my pocket. But I wasn't ready to reveal that card yet. We should probably wait until we've spoken with his lawyer. Grace's smile flickered for just a moment. Oh. Did he discuss something with you that I should know about? Funny you should ask. I reached for my wine glass, noting how Grace's knuckles whitened around her fork. What exactly did Dad say to you the night before he changed his will? The silence that followed was absolute. Even Mom stopped eating, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. I don't know what you're talking about, Grace said, but there was a new edge to her voice. Mom, these potatoes are divine. Did you use rosemary? Don't change the subject, Grace. I leaned forward. What did you do? Piper! Mom's sharp tone could have cut glass. Your sister is trying to hold this family together, and you're being absolutely. Holding us together? I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Is that what we're calling it now? Grace set down her cutlery with deliberate care. I know you're hurting, Piper. We all are. But lashing out isn't going to bring Dad back. Don't you dare use Dad to manipulate me. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Not after what you did. What I did. Grace's voice rose slightly, her perfect mask slipping. What exactly are you accusing me of? Girls, please, Mom intervened, reaching for Grace's hand. This isn't the time. It's never the time, is it, Mom? I moved toward the study door. Well, maybe it's time to look behind some closed doors. Or should I say, behind some paintings? Grace's face went white. She knocked over her wine glass as she stood, red liquid spreading across the pristine tablecloth like blood. Piper, wait. But I was already at the study door. Grace reached me just as I pushed it open, her fingers digging into my arm. You don't understand, she hissed, low enough that Mom couldn't hear. There are things you don't know about Dad, about the company. Then enlighten me. I jerked my arm free. Tell me why you visited him that night. Tell me what you said that made him change everything. I was protecting us. Her voice cracked, showing the first real emotion I'd seen from her since Dad's death. If you'd just let me handle this. Like you've handled everything else? I moved toward the lighthouse painting. Always taking control, always pushing me aside. Stop! The word exploded from her with such force that Mom appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. What's going on? Grace, darling, are you all right? I reached for the painting. Don't, Grace whispered, and for the first time, I heard fear in her voice. Real fear. I turned to look at her, my hands still on the frame. Why not? What are you so afraid I'll find? Her next words stopped me cold. Because if you look behind that painting, you'll destroy everything. Including yourself. The worst part wasn't the threat in her voice. It was the pity. Martha's garden gnomes watched me with judgmental ceramic eyes as I crossed her front lawn the next morning. I'd seen her watching our house during the previous night's drama, her silhouette visible through her kitchen window like some neighborhood sentinel. Well, if it isn't the other Johnson girl. Martha opened her door before I could knock, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. I suppose you're here about the commotion last night. Actually, I'm here about Dad. I followed her into a living room that smelled of cats and coffee. And about Grace. Martha's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Aren't we all always about Grace? She poured coffee into delicate cups that probably hadn't seen daylight since the Reagan administration. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp when she looked at me. Your father came to see me, you know. 2 days before he died. The coffee scalded my tongue. What? Oh yes. Quite upset, he was. Something about irregularities in the company books. She paused, studying my face. Books that Grace had been handling. My chest tightened. What kind of irregularities? The kind that end with federal investigations. Martha set down her cup with a decisive clink. Your sister's been cooking those books for years. Tom finally caught on when he noticed discrepancies in the pension fund. The room tilted sideways. The pension fund. Dad's pride and joy, meant to secure retirement for every employee who'd ever worked for Johnson and Associates. But that's impossible. Grace wouldn't. Wouldn't she? Martha's voice turned gentle. Think about it, dear. The designer clothes, the luxury apartment, that fancy car of hers. Did you ever wonder how a junior executive could afford all that? My hands started shaking so badly I had to set down my cup. Dad confronted her, didn't he? That night before he changed his will. He did more than confront her. Martha reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. He gave me these to hold on to. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got them. The envelope contained spreadsheets, bank statements, and a USB drive. But it was the last item that made my blood run cold, a formal letter of confession, signed by Grace, admitting to years of systematic embezzlement. She blackmailed him, I whispered. That's why he changed the will. She threatened to what? Take the fall publicly? Drag the company's name through the mud? Martha's silence was answer enough. But why give these to you? Because I'm the only one your mother doesn't talk to anymore. Martha's smile was bitter. Not since I caught Helen with that tennis instructor 20 years ago. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Mom had an affair? Oh, honey. Martha reached across and patted my hand. Why do you think Grace has always been the favorite? Guilt is a powerful motivator. My phone buzzed, a text from Grace, where are you? Mom's worried. Come home and we can talk about everything. Another buzz, family first, remember? I looked at the evidence in my hands, then at Martha. What am I supposed to do with all this? That depends. Martha's eyes were kind but unflinching. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? Because believe me, there's a difference. And what's the difference? Justice might save the company, might even save your sister from herself. She paused. Revenge will destroy everything, including parts of yourself you might want to keep. I stood up, gathering the documents. Maybe some things need to be destroyed before they can be rebuilt. Just like your father, Martha murmured. He said almost the same thing that last day. Right before his heart attack. I froze halfway to the door. His heart attack? Curious timing, wasn't it? Martha's voice followed me out. The very next morning after his confrontation with Grace. The doctors called it stress-induced, but she let the sentence hang unfinished in the air between us. Outside, the morning sun felt too bright, too harsh. My phone buzzed again with another message from Grace. Whatever you're planning, don't. Please. Some secrets should stay buried. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, then up at our family home, where Grace stood watching from Dad's study window. Some secrets should stay buried. But I was done living in the shadows of other people's lies. The USB drive from Martha's envelope sat on my laptop like a digital grenade. Behind me, Dad's lighthouse painting watched, still guarding its own secrets. I hadn't touched it since that night. Some truths demand perfect timing. My phone lit up with Grace's 15th message, the board meeting's tomorrow. Last chance to talk. I plugged in the drive. Folders appeared, labeled by year, each containing meticulous records of Grace's creative accounting. But it was a video file that caught my eye, tj_final_statement.mp4. Dad's face filled my screen, looking exhausted, recorded the night before his death. If you're watching this, Piper, then I failed to make things right. He rubbed his face, and I noticed his hands shaking. Grace has given me an ultimatum. Either I sign over controlling interest in the company, or she releases documents showing years of tax evasion, documents she fabricated. But convincing enough to destroy everything we've built. A knock at my door made me jump. Grace stood there, wearing the same cream blazer she'd worn to Dad's funeral. I slammed my laptop shut. Ever heard of waiting for an answer? We need to talk. She closed the door behind her, eyes scanning my room. About Dad's study. About the painting. About how you killed him? The words hung between us like smoke. Grace's perfect posture faltered for just a moment. Is that what Martha told you? Her laugh sounded hollow. That bitter old woman has been trying to destroy our family for years. The evidence suggests you've been doing a pretty good job of that yourself. Grace moved to my window, staring out at Martha's house. You have no idea what Dad was really like. What he made me do. Made you do? I stood up, anger rising. He gave you everything. The attention, the opportunities, the pressure. She whirled around. Perfect Grace, golden child, future CEO. Do you know what it's like, living up to impossible expectations? Having to be flawless every single day? Poor you, I spat. Try being invisible. You think I wanted that for you? Her voice cracked. Dad used us against each other from the beginning. He'd praise me to punish you, then threaten me with you taking over whenever I failed. Piper would never disappoint me like this. Piper understands responsibility. I opened my laptop again, turning it toward her. Is that why you embezzled millions from the pension fund? To prove something to Dad? Her face went blank, that perfect mask sliding back into place. Those records are inadmissible. And incomplete. Incomplete? Check the dates. She moved closer, perfectly manicured nail tapping the screen. Dad's signature authorized every transfer. He knew exactly what was happening to that money. You're lying. Am I? She pulled out her phone, showing me emails between her and Dad. He needed someone to blame if things went wrong. Who better than the golden child? The perfect scapegoat. My head spun. But your confession letter. Insurance. Her smile was razor sharp. Dad taught me well, always keep leverage. She headed for the door, then paused. You have until tomorrow's board meeting to decide whose side you're really on. Family protects family, Piper. Even from themselves. After she left, I replayed Dad's video, watching for any sign of deception. His familiar features blurred as he spoke his final words. I've failed you both, but you can still save each other. Behind the painting. The truth will set you free, but first it will break your heart. I moved to the study, my fingers trembling as they touched the lighthouse painting's frame. Inside my pocket, Grace's final text buzzed, "Some things are better left buried. Don't make me choose between protecting you and protecting myself." The painting felt heavier than it should as I lifted it from the wall. Behind it, a small wall safe waited, and with it, answers that would change everything. But whose truth would I find? Dad's final confession, or Grace's perfect lie? Only one way to find out. The safe's contents spilled across Dad's desk like evidence at a crime scene. Bank statements. Legal documents. A small black notebook filled with Dad's cramped handwriting. And beneath it all, a single photograph I'd never seen before, Dad and Grace at her college graduation, both smiling. His hand gripping her shoulder so tightly his knuckles were white. The board meeting was in 3 hours. My suitcase waited by the door, packed with everything I couldn't bear to leave behind. Planning a trip? Mom stood in the doorway, her face a perfect mask of concern. Just like Grace's. Just like every mask in this house of lies. I'm leaving. I gathered the documents, shoving them into my bag. I know about the pension fund. About Dad's involvement. About everything. She moved into the room with deliberate steps. Your father did what he had to do to protect this family. By stealing from his employees? By using Grace as a shield? By keeping us together. Her voice hardened. Something you seem determined to destroy. I pulled out Dad's notebook, flipping to a marked page. Did you know he was recording everything? Every threat, every manipulation, every time Grace came to him crying because the pressure was too much. Mom's hand shot out, faster than I expected, but I jerked the notebook away. You don't understand what's at stake, she hissed. I understand perfectly. Dad built his empire on fraud, used Grace as his puppet, and now you're trying to bury everything to protect your perfect little world. To protect you. The words exploded from her. Everything we did was to protect you. From what? From becoming like him. She grabbed the photograph from the desk. Look at her face, Piper. Really look. Do you know why Grace was his favorite? Because she was weak enough to control. But you. Her laugh was bitter. You were too much like him. Too stubborn. Too dangerous. The truth hit like a physical blow. You pushed me away to save me? And now you're proving us right. She stepped closer. Going to the board meeting with your evidence, your righteous anger. Ready to burn it all down. Just like he would have done. My phone buzzed. Grace, the board's calling an emergency session. Moving the meeting up. Where are you? I have to go. I grabbed my suitcase. If you do this, there's no coming back. Mom's voice followed me down the hall. You'll destroy Grace. Is that what you want? To become the monster you think she is? I stopped at the front door, Dad's notebook heavy in my hand. Through the window, I could see Martha in her garden, watching. Always watching. Maybe we're all monsters, I said. Maybe that's the real family legacy. Piper, please. But I was already moving, my feet carrying me toward the car, toward the board meeting, toward whatever truth or lie waited at the end of this path. Another text from Grace, I know what you found in the safe. Remember when we were kids? How we promised to always protect each other. Please, don't make me break that promise. I started the engine, the familiar rumble matching my racing heart. In the rearview mirror, Mom stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against her chest. Beyond her, I could see Dad's study window, the empty space where the lighthouse painting had hung for 20 years. The painting itself lay in my trunk, wrapped in an old blanket. I hadn't checked behind it yet, one last mystery, one last truth to uncover. But first, the board meeting. First, the reckoning. My phone buzzed one final time. Martha, whatever you decide, remember, revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Your father never learned the difference. Will you? I pulled away from the house, leaving behind everything I'd ever known about family, about love, about truth itself. In 3 hours, I would either save my sister or destroy her. In 3 hours, I would either become my father's daughter or break free of his legacy forever. In 3 hours, I would learn if some monsters are born, or if they're created by the very people who claim to love them. The Johnson and Associates boardroom felt smaller than I remembered, shrunk by the weight of 20 pairs of eyes fixed on the USB drive in my hand. Grace sat at the head of the table, Dad's old seat, her cream blazer a stark contrast against the dark wood. As I was saying, she continued smoothly, as if my entrance hadn't interrupted her mid-sentence. The transition plan following my father's death ensures stability for all stakeholders. Before we continue, I placed the drive on the table, watching it spin slightly like a compass needle seeking north. There's something the board needs to see. Grace's smile didn't waver, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. My sister is understandably emotional given recent events. Perhaps we should discuss the pension fund. The words fell like stones into still water. And why it's currently $8 million lighter than it should be. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Board member Davidson leaned forward, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. Miss Johnson, what exactly are you suggesting? I reached for the drive, but Grace's hand shot out, covering mine. Her fingers were ice cold. Don't, she whispered. Please. For a moment, I was 8 years old again, watching Grace cry after falling from her bike, promising to never let anything hurt her again. Then I remembered Dad's notebook, the photograph, the years of manipulation. I pulled away, plugging in the drive. The documents I'm about to show you, I started, but Grace cut me off. Were fabricated by our father to cover his own fraud. The room went silent. On the screen behind me, numbers scrolled past, dates, transactions, signatures. Dad was embezzling funds for years, Grace continued, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. I discovered it 6 months ago. Everything I did was to protect the company, to protect our employees. That's not, I stopped, staring at the documents. Something was wrong. The signatures, the dates. I tried to stop him, Grace's voice cracked perfectly. When he found out I knew, he threatened to frame me. That's why he changed his will, why he left those false records. He knew I would expose him eventually. Davidson was nodding. Others were murmuring sympathetically. I fumbled through Dad's notebook, but the pages seemed different somehow, dates altered, entries changed. You switched them, I whispered. When did you? The real question, Grace addressed the board, is why my sister is so desperate to destroy our father's legacy. To destroy this company. That's not what, but I could hear myself stammering, see the board members' expressions shifting from concern to suspicion. I move to reject these unsubstantiated allegations, Davidson announced, and proceed with the leadership transition as planned. All in favor? Grace asked softly. Hands rose around the table like a forest of judgment. In my pocket, my phone buzzed, a message from Mom, I warned you. Some truths are better left buried. I think, Grace said, still gentle, still perfect, my sister needs time to grieve properly. Perhaps a leave of absence. You can't just. All in favor? More hands. More sympathetic looks. More perfect manipulation. I backed toward the door, clutching Dad's notebook, useless now, tainted by doubt. Grace's victory smile flickered across her face for just a moment before concern replaced it. Piper, wait. But I was already running, past the reception desk, past the family photos in the lobby. Past everything I thought I knew about truth and justice and family. In my car, another text waited, Martha this time. Check behind the painting. Now. The lighthouse painting lay in my trunk, still wrapped in its blanket. With trembling fingers, I turned it over, finding a small tear in the backing. Inside was a single micro SD card. My phone buzzed one final time. Grace, I know about the painting. Remember what Dad always said? In chess, the queen protects the king. But he never told us what happens when the king is gone and there can only be one queen. I stared at the SD card, then at the company building rising behind me like a glass and steel tombstone. One last truth. One last chance. But was I ready to see what was really hiding behind the lighthouse's beam? The SD card's contents played across Martha's ancient desktop computer, the footage grainy but clear enough. Dad's study, late at night. Grace entering, tears streaming down her face. Their argument escalating until. He had a heart attack right there, Martha said quietly. While threatening to destroy her. But she didn't call for help. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. She just watched. For 18 minutes. Martha's garden gnomes stared through the window, silent witnesses to another family's destruction. Then she made it look like she just found him. My phone buzzed, Grace, again, where are you? The memorial starts in an hour. The memorial. Of course. One last performance for the grieving daughter. I have to go. I stood, pocketing the SD card. Thank you, Martha. For everything. She caught my arm. Remember, revenge might feel like justice, but it burns everything it touches. The church was already full when I arrived. Grace stood at the podium, radiant in black, her eulogy reducing the board members to tears. Mom sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes. I walked straight up the center aisle. He was the kind of father who always put family first, Grace was saying. Who taught us about integrity, about watching someone die? My voice carried through the church. About letting your father have a heart attack while you stood there for 18 minutes? The silence was absolute. Grace's perfect mask slipped for just a moment. Piper, she recovered smoothly, grief affects us all differently. Perhaps you should. Perhaps we should watch the video. I held up the SD card. Dad's study has security cameras. Did you forget that when you let him die? Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mom stood up, reaching for me, but I stepped away. You don't understand, Grace's voice cracked. He was going to destroy everything. The company, our family, my future. Because you were stealing from it. Because he made me. The words exploded from her. Every transaction, every fraud, it was all him. I was just trying to fix it, to protect everyone, and he threatened to expose you? I moved closer to the podium. Like you threatened to expose him? Grace's composure shattered. He deserved it. Do you know what it's like, being his perfect little puppet? Having to dance on his strings while he pulled them tighter and tighter? Girls, please, Mom intervened, but we ignored her. So you watched him die. I was close enough now to see Grace trembling. Your own father. He wasn't a father. Grace's mascara ran in black streaks. He was a monster who created another monster. Isn't that right, Mom? Isn't that why you kept Piper away? Because you saw him in her? The congregation gasped. Mom froze, her face ashen. But you were wrong, Grace continued, laughing hysterically. I'm the one who became him. I'm the one who learned his games, his manipulation, his... Enough! Mom's voice cracked like a whip. Both of you, stop this. But it was too late. Board members were standing, phones recording. Davidson's face had turned purple with rage. The truth hurts, doesn't it, Mom? I held up Dad's notebook. Just like it hurt when Dad found out about the tennis instructor? When he used that knowledge to control you, just like he controlled Grace? Piper, don't, Grace reached for me. Don't what? Tell the truth? Isn't that what this whole thing has been about? The truth? Grace's laugh was bitter. The truth is, we're all monsters here. Every single one of us. The only difference is, I admitted it to myself a long time ago. She turned to face the shocked congregation, spreading her arms wide. Welcome to the real Johnson family. We're not what you thought we were. We never were. The chaos that followed was almost beautiful in its destruction. As security led Grace away from the podium, as board members shouted for lawyers, as Mom collapsed into her seat, I stood in the center of it all. Feeling strangely empty. Martha's words echoed in my head, revenge burns everything it touches. I looked down at the SD card in my hand, then at my sisters retreating back. And wondered if some fires were necessary to clear the way for something new to grow. The real estate agent's heels clicked against the hardwood floors of my childhood home, her voice echoing through empty rooms. The bank is motivated to sell, given the circumstances. Your offer is quite generous, considering. I'll take it. I signed the papers without hesitation, my name stark against the white paper. Piper Johnson, no longer in anyone's shadow. Grace's trial was set for next month. The news had called it everything from corporate fraud to criminal negligence, but none of the headlines captured the truth. We were all guilty of something. Mom hadn't spoken to me since the memorial. Her silence said more than words ever could. I moved through the house, rooms stripped bare except for Dad's study. The lighthouse painting hung there again, restored to its place like a sentinel. But this time, I knew what lay behind it, not just the safe, but generations of carefully crafted lies. The doorbell rang. Martha stood on the porch, holding a cardboard box. Found these while cleaning out my attic, she said, setting it down. Thought you might want them. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Me and Grace as children, before the manipulation began. Before Dad's games turned us into players instead of daughters. before Mom's guilt shaped us into what she feared and what she hoped for. Grace asked about you, Martha said quietly. During visiting hours. I stiffened. And? She said something interesting. About the night your father died. Martha's eyes were kind but unflinching. About how he admitted everything just before his heart attack. The affairs, the fraud, using both of you as pawns. She said she watched him die because she couldn't bear to save another monster. My hands trembled over the photographs. Why are you telling me this? Because revenge and justice aren't the only paths to freedom. Sometimes understanding is enough. I thought of Grace in her prison cell, of Mom in her self-imposed exile, of Dad's final manipulations reaching beyond the grave. We were all prisoners of our own making. The sound of a car door closing drew our attention. Mom stood in the driveway, looking smaller somehow, more human. The tennis instructor, she said without preamble. He wasn't the first. Or the last. Your father. He knew about all of them. Used them to control me, like he used everything else. I let him favor Grace because I thought it would protect her. Instead, we all became what we feared most, I finished. She nodded, tears falling. I'm selling the company. Using the money to repay the pension fund. And Grace? Will serve her time. But when she gets out. Mom straightened, finding her strength. We'll try again. All of us. If you want. Martha squeezed my hand and left us there. Her garden gnomes watching from across the street as mother and daughter stood in the wreckage of their perfect family facade. I walked Mom to the study, where the lighthouse painting still hung. Together, we took it down, revealing the empty safe behind it. He taught us all how to hide, Mom whispered. Then maybe it's time to learn how to be seen. I turned the painting over, finding one last surprise, a handwritten note tucked into the frame, Dad's familiar scrawl faded but clear. To my daughters, the lighthouse warns ships away from dangerous shores. But sometimes the greatest danger lies in the safe harbor we never dare to leave. Be braver than I was. Be better. Be free. Mom touched the words gently. Will you stay? In this house? Yes, I said. But not to preserve his legacy or protect our secrets. I'm staying to build something new. Something true. Through the study window, I could see Martha in her garden, tending to her gnomes. Beyond her, the sun set over our quiet street, where perfect families lived in perfect houses, each with their own lighthouses. Their own dangerous shores. But here, in this house of broken mirrors and shattered illusions, something else was possible. Something real. I hung a different painting in place of the lighthouse, a simple sunrise, full of promise and uncertainty. Sometimes the greatest act of revenge is choosing to stop playing the game altogether.
From the moment I could understand my father's words, I knew he'd always longed for a son. Instead, he got me, Jennifer, and my younger sister. Dad was an ophthalmologist, a damn good one too. But he had bigger dreams. When I was about 5, he opened his first eyeglass store. I remember the day clearly, the smell of fresh paint, the gleaming displays, and Dad's proud smile as he cut the ribbon. As the years passed, Dad's business grew. He took out a loan, opened a lens production facility, and before we knew it, he had a chain of stores across the state. By the time I hit high school, Dad's company was a proper empire, 30 stores and a high-tech manufacturing plant. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make Dad proud. While other kids were hanging out at the mall or going to parties, I was nose-deep in textbooks or helping out at one of Dad's stores after school. Every day after school, I'd head to the store, learning everything I could. How to handle customers, manage inventory, even basic bookkeeping. I was determined to prove myself. My sister, on the other hand, couldn't care less about the family business. She was always off in her own world, paintbrush in hand, creating these wild, colorful masterpieces. Dad tried to get her interested, but it was like trying to teach a fish to climb a tree. Jennifer, my dance teacher, said one day after class, "You've got real talent. Have you ever thought about pursuing dance professionally?" I hesitated. Truth was, I loved dancing. The freedom, the expression, the pure joy of movement. But I pushed the thought away. "Thanks, Miss Davis, but I've got other plans." As high school came to an end, I applied to college for finance and management. Economics and finance didn't come naturally to me like dancing did. But I gritted my teeth and pushed through. Late nights, endless cups of coffee, and more spreadsheets than I care to remember. Meanwhile, my sister breezed through art school, met a guy, and got married right after graduation. To everyone's surprise, her new husband started working for Dad's company. The day I graduated college, I felt a mix of relief and determination. As I walked across that stage, diploma in hand, I could see Dad in the audience, grinning from ear to ear. This was it. I was ready to take on the family business. As I stepped off the bus in my hometown, the familiar sights and smells washed over me. It felt like nothing had changed, but everything was different. I was different. No longer the wide-eyed girl who left for college, but a woman with a degree and a purpose. Dad was waiting for me, leaning against his car with that proud smile I'd always longed to see. "Welcome home, Jen," he said, pulling me into a bear hug. "Ready to get to work?" I nodded, determination stealing my spine. "More than ready, Dad." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Dad started me off in accounting, dealing with primary documentation. It wasn't glamorous, but I threw myself into it with gusto. Every invoice, every receipt, every ledger entry was a step towards proving myself. Years passed, and I climbed the corporate ladder. Deputy Chief Accountant, that was my new title. I was helping Dad with budget planning now, feeling like I was finally making a real difference in the company. My brother-in-law, Tom, was rising through the ranks too. Dad made him head of the supply department, and man, did that guy know how to schmooze. Dad loved him, treated him like the son he never had. I tried not to let it bother me, focusing instead on my own work. But I couldn't help feeling a twinge of jealousy every time I saw them laughing together in Dad's office. Then came the day Dad called me into his office. My heart was pounding as I sat down across from him. "Jennifer," he said, his face serious. "I've been thinking. You've done great work in accounting, and I think it's time for a change." I held my breath, hoping against hope that this was it, the moment I'd been working towards all these years. "I'm making you manager of our retail chain," he said, smiling. "And Tom? He's going to be my deputy at the lens factory." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Manager of the retail chain? It was a step up, sure, but it wasn't what I'd been hoping for. And Tom, he was now second in command at the factory, the heart of our business. "Thanks, Dad," I managed to say, forcing a smile. "I won't let you down." As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard I worked, I'd always be playing second fiddle to Tom. Weeks went by, and I threw myself into my new role. I was determined to prove that I could do more than just crunch numbers. But then, something strange happened. I was reviewing a new shipment of glasses when I noticed some discrepancies in the documents Tom had provided. The numbers didn't add up, and something about the quality felt off. "Hey, Tom," I said, catching him in the hallway. "Can we talk about these documents for the new shipment? Some things aren't quite clear." He barely glanced at the papers. "Everything's fine, Jen. You're probably just overthinking it." His dismissive tone rubbed me the wrong way. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the integrity of our business. I decided to dig deeper. I went to the head office and requested a quality check on the latest batch of lenses and glasses. Something wasn't right, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the quality check results, when Dad burst into my office. His face was red, and I could practically see the steam coming out of his ears. "Jennifer," he bellowed. "Who gave you the authority to order quality checks? You're overstepping your bounds, young lady." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. I noticed some inconsistencies in the documents for the new shipment. I was just trying to. "To what?" he interrupted again. "To show everyone how smart you are? To undermine Tom's work?" His words stung. "No, Dad. I was trying to protect our company. If there's something wrong with the products..." "Enough." He slammed his hand on my desk, making me flinch. "You don't have the authority to give instructions to the company or arrange inspections. I'm the head of this company, not you. Do you understand?" With that, he stormed out, leaving me standing there, feeling small and stupid. For days after that, I went through the motions at work. I did my job, nothing more, nothing less. The passion I once had felt like it had been sucked out of me. Then, one evening, Mom called. "Jennifer, honey," she said, her voice excited. "Your father's decided to retire. We want to throw him a party, and I was hoping you could help organize it." I felt a mix of emotions, relief that Dad was stepping down, anxiety about what that meant for the company, and a petty part of me that wanted to refuse just to spite him. But in the end, the part of me that still yearned for his approval won out. "Sure, Mom," I said. "I'd be happy to help." As I planned the party, an idea struck me. Dad had always loved jazz. What if I could get his favorite band to play at the party? It would be expensive, sure, but seeing the look on his face would be worth it. I called Mom to run the idea by her, and she agreed enthusiastically. We decided to split the cost, I, Mom, and Sarah and Tom. I called Sarah next. "Hey, sis," I said. "I've got an idea for Dad's retirement party. What do you think about getting his favorite jazz band to play?" There was a pause on the other end. "I don't know, Jen," Sarah said hesitantly. "Sounds expensive. Let me talk to Tom about it." I waited anxiously for her response. Hours turned into days, and finally, Sarah called back. "Sorry, Jen," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "Tom says it's too expensive. We can't chip in." In the end, Mom and I split the cost ourselves. It was a stretch for my budget, but I was determined to make this party special for Dad. The night of the party arrived, and the venue was buzzing with excitement. The place looked fantastic, if I do say so myself. Soft jazz played in the background as guests mingled, waiting for the main event. As the evening progressed, the moment I'd been waiting for finally arrived. The lights dimmed, and the first notes of Dad's favorite jazz band filled the air. I held my breath, watching Dad's face. His eyes widened in disbelief, then filled with tears. He stood there, transfixed, as the music washed over him. I've never seen him look so genuinely happy. "I can't believe it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "They're here. They're really here." I felt a warmth spread through my chest. This was the moment I'd been working towards. I opened my mouth to tell Dad it was my idea when Tom suddenly appeared at Dad's side. "Surprise, Dad," Tom said, clapping Dad on the shoulder. "Sarah and I thought you'd like this little treat." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I took a step forward, ready to set the record straight, when I felt a hand on my arm. It was Mom. "Jennifer, honey," she said quietly, her eyes pleading. "Let it go. Don't spoil the moment for your father." I wanted to argue, to shout the truth from the rooftops. But looking at Dad's happy face, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I swallowed hard and nodded, forcing a smile. As the night wound down, Dad took the stage for a speech. I perked up, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he'd acknowledge my role in organizing everything. "Family," Dad began, his voice thick with emotion. Family is everything. And tonight, as I prepare to step away from the company I built, I'm filled with gratitude for the support you've all given me. I smiled, waiting for my name to be mentioned. But more than that, Dad continued, I'm filled with hope for the future. Hope that this company will continue to thrive for generations to come. And that's why I've made a decision. It's time to pass the torch. I straightened up, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was it. All those years of hard work were about to pay off. Tom, Dad said, turning to my brother-in-law with a proud smile. I'm making you the new CEO of the company. The room erupted in applause, but I couldn't hear it over the roaring in my ears. Tom? He was giving the company to Tom? Not only that, Dad continued, oblivious to my shock, but I'm also entrusting our entire chain of eyewear stores to Tom's capable hands. I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. After Dad's announcement, I approached him, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad, what about me? He looked at me, his expression a mix of pity and condescension that made my blood boil. Jennifer, sweetheart, he said, patting my shoulder. You're a woman. Which means you're a priori stupid and incompetent in management matters. You don't understand anything about running a company. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But Dad, I've worked so hard. I dedicated my life to this company. He waved his hand dismissively. I know, and that's admirable. But let's face it, you've always been more interested in dancing, haven't you? Now you can pursue that without worrying about the company. Leave the business to those who can actually do it. Without another word, I turned and walked away. I grabbed my coat, ignored my mother's concerned calls, and stormed out of the restaurant. As the cool night air hit my face, I finally let the tears flow. A couple of hours later, I was already packing my bags. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. Away from the family business, away from my father's crushing disappointment, away from Tom's smug face. My phone buzzed. It was my sister, Sarah. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Jen? Sarah's voice was irritatingly chipper. Where are you? Dad's looking for you. He wants to know when you're planning to serve the cake. Tom's got a sweet tooth, you know. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything that had happened, they were worried about cake? Tell your husband to figure out the cake situation himself, I snapped. He's the big boss now, isn't he? I hung up before she could respond. With my bags packed and my resignation letter emailed to HR, I left town. I ended up in a city a few hours away, determined to start fresh. It wasn't easy at first. I landed a junior position at a large auditing firm. The work was challenging, but I threw myself into it with everything I had. No more trying to please anyone but myself. Years passed. I climbed the corporate ladder, earning a reputation as a skilled and dedicated auditor. The firm gave me increasingly difficult and interesting cases, trusting my judgment and expertise. And in the evenings, I danced. I found a studio near my apartment and started taking classes again. It felt like coming home, like rediscovering a part of myself I had buried for far too long. I barely spoke to my family during this time. Occasional calls with Mom, sure, but we kept things superficial. I didn't ask about Dad or the business, and she didn't volunteer any information. Life was good. I had a high-paying job I excelled at, a beautiful apartment in a nice neighborhood, and I was finally pursuing my passion for dance. I felt free, truly happy for the first time in years. Then, one evening, everything changed again. I was walking home from dance class, my body pleasantly sore from a challenging routine, when I saw her. Sarah was standing outside my building, looking lost and disheveled. Jennifer, she called out, her voice trembling. I need your help. How did you find me? I asked, my voice cold. Sarah looked down, ashamed. Mom gave me your address. We need your help, Jen. Tom's in trouble. The company, it's being audited by the tax authorities. And, and your firm is conducting the audit." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had a feeling I knew where this was going, but I let her continue. "We need you to influence the results of the audit," Sarah pleaded. Just tell them everything's fine with the accounting. Please, Jen. We're family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you seriously asking me to commit fraud? To risk my career, my reputation, everything I built here?" Sarah nodded desperately. "I'll pay you $100,000. Please, Jen. We're desperate." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Tom had screwed up, big time. And now they wanted me to cover for him, to jeopardize everything I'd worked for. "This conversation is over," I said, pulling out my phone. "If you ever suggest something like this again, I'm calling the police." Sarah's face crumpled. She placed a hand on her belly, and I noticed for the first time that she was pregnant. "Please, Jen," she begged. "Think of your niece or nephew. You wouldn't want them to grow up without a father, would you?" I felt a surge of anger. "Your pregnancy doesn't change the fact that your husband is a fraud," I spat. "Now leave, before I call the cops." Sarah's demeanor changed instantly. She started screaming, hurling insults at me, causing a scene right there on the street. Passers-by began to stare, some pulling out their phones. I'd had enough. Without another word, I turned and walked into my building, leaving Sarah screaming on the sidewalk. A month passed after Sarah's unexpected visit. I threw myself into work, trying to forget about the whole ordeal. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One evening, as I was reviewing some files for a particularly complex audit, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I feared Sarah had returned. But when I opened the door, I was shocked to see my parents standing there. They looked older, more tired than I remembered. Dad, once the picture of confidence, now seemed small and defeated. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. "Jennifer," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we come in? We need to talk." Hesitantly, I let them in. We sat in my living room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. Finally, Dad spoke. "We've come to ask for your forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking. "We've made terrible mistakes, and we've wronged you deeply." What followed was a confession that left me reeling. Tom, the golden boy, the son my father never had been running a massive scam for years. He'd been buying counterfeit lenses cheaply from South Asia and passing them off as expensive branded products through our chain of stores and pocketing the difference. He'd been siphoning money into offshore accounts for years. As they spoke, a memory surfaced. Years ago, when I'd noticed discrepancies in Tom's reports and tried to investigate. Dad had shut me down, accusing me of overstepping. Now, I realized just how right I'd been. The consequences were devastating. The subpar products were causing allergic reactions in patients. Lawsuits were piling up. The company that my father had built from the ground up, the legacy he'd been so proud of, was now teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. "We were blind," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't want to see what was right in front of us." Dad reached out, tentatively taking my hand. "Jennifer, we know we have no right to ask this of you. But, we need your help. The company needs you. Will you come back and take over? You're the only one who can save it now." I stood there, my parents' plea echoing in my ears. For a moment, I was tempted. The challenge of saving the company, of proving once and for all that I was capable, it was alluring. But then, like a flood, all the memories came rushing back. I remembered the disappointment in my father's eyes when I was born, not the son he'd always wanted. The countless times he'd dismissed my ideas and efforts. The way he'd so easily handed over the reins to Tom, calling me incompetent and stupid. The years I'd spent trying to prove myself, only to be cast aside. And now, here they were, asking me to swoop in and save them. To sacrifice everything I'd built for myself, all for a company that had never truly been mine. I looked at them, really looked at them. Despite the current crisis, they were still well off. They had money, they had resources. This wasn't about survival, it was about pride. My father's pride. His legacy. In that moment, I made my decision. No, I said, my voice firm and unwavering. They both looked shocked, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. I'm not ready to forgive you, and I don't want to communicate with you anymore. Where was all this concern when you were calling me incompetent? When you were handing over my birthright to Tom? You didn't think about me then, did you? My father tried to interject, but I wasn't finished. And now that you're in trouble, suddenly you remember me? Suddenly I'm capable enough to run the company? No, I won't do it. I won't sacrifice everything I built here to save your pride. My words hung in the air, heavy and final. I saw the hope drain from their faces, replaced by a mix of regret and despair. But it's your legacy too, my father said weakly. I shook my head. No, it's not. You made that very clear when you chose Tom over me. This is your mess. You clean it up. My mother was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but I steeled myself against it. I'd spent too many years trying to please them, trying to be what they wanted me to be. No more. I think you should leave now, I said, moving towards the door. They stood slowly, looking lost and defeated. As I watched them walk down the hallway, looking small and pitiful, a part of me ached. But a larger part felt free. For the first time in my life, I had put myself first. Months passed, and life moved on. I heard through the grapevine about the fallout from my family's crisis. Dad had taken the reins of the company once again. It wasn't easy, but slowly, he was rebuilding the reputation he'd spent a lifetime creating. Tom wasn't so lucky. Fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement, the list of charges was long. He ended up behind bars, his offshore accounts frozen, drowning in fines and debt. Sarah, now a single mother, had moved back in with our parents. I heard she was struggling to adjust to her new reality. Sometimes, I felt a pang of sympathy for her and her child, but I reminded myself that she had made her choices. As for me? Well, life had a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. It happened one evening at the dance studio. I was lost in the music, my body moving freely to the rhythm, when I noticed him. A man with a camera, capturing the dancers' movements. There was something about the way he looked at the world through his lens that intrigued me. After class, he approached me. "Hi, I'm Alex," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "I hope you don't mind, but I got some great shots of you dancing. You're really talented." We got to talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. Alex was a freelance photographer, with a passion for capturing moments of pure joy and freedom. As we parted ways that night, he hesitated for a moment. "Listen, Jennifer," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime? Or dinner, maybe?" I surprised myself by saying yes without hesitation. That was the beginning of something beautiful. Alex and I started dating, and with him, I discovered a side of myself I never knew existed. He encouraged me to be more open, more free-spirited. Through his eyes, I saw the world in a new light. Our relationship developed naturally, without pressure or expectations. We enjoyed each other's company, shared our passions, and supported each other's dreams. For the first time in my life, I was with someone who saw me for who I truly was, not for who they wanted me to be. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through the city park, Alex turned to me. "You know, Jen," he said, his eyes twinkling, "you've changed since we first met. You're more, you. More open, more free. It suits you." I thought about his words, about the journey I'd been on. From the dutiful daughter trying to prove herself, to the woman who stood up for herself, to now, someone who was learning to embrace life with open arms. "You're right," I said, returning his smile. "I do feel different. Freer. Happier." As we continued our walk, I reflected on the twists and turns my life had taken. The pain, the disappointments, the hard decisions, they had all led me here, to this moment. I wasn't the person I thought I'd be all those years ago, working in my father's company. I was someone better, someone true to herself. My name's Laura, and I'm the younger of two sisters in what you might call a blended family. But blended implies some kind of harmony, and let me tell you, there wasn't much of that growing up. My mom had been married before, to some guy who died when my half-sister was 5. Then she met my dad, they got hitched, and pop. Out I came a year later. Sounds like a neat little package, right? Wrong. See, my mom had this house she inherited from her first husband. Nice place, nothing too fancy. She also owned a sewing factory. After she and my dad tied the knot, she asked him to help run the business. They made a good team, I'll give him that. Dad handled the money stuff, Mom took care of making things and dealing with people. They doubled the company's profits in no time. I remember overhearing them talk about the future once when I was little. They were in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. I hope the girls will take over someday, Mom said. Keep it in the family, you know? Dad agreed. That'd be great. Laura's got a good eye for design already. And Sarah's sharp with numbers. Little did they know, Sarah had other ideas. My dear half-sister never let me forget that everything, the house, the business, even the damn spoons we ate with, belonged to her and Mom. This is my house, she'd say, blocking the door to her room. You're just living in it, 'cause your dad mooches off Mom. I was too young to understand why she was so mean. I just wanted to play with her cool toys or borrow a pencil to draw. But every time I touched something, she'd snatch it away. That's mine, she'd screech. My real dad bought it before he died. You can't have it. Mom tried to stop her. Sarah, honey, that's not nice. Laura's your sister. Half-sister, Sarah would spit back. And she gets everything. It's not fair. Dad never said much during these fights. He'd just pat my head and tell me to ignore her. But how could I? She made my life hell. One day, I found some colored pencils in the living room. I was so excited, finally, I could draw the beautiful dresses I saw in my head. I started sketching, lost in my own little world. Then Sarah stormed in. Those are mine, she yelled, grabbing the pencils. Before I could stop her, she tore up my drawings. I ran to Mom, sobbing. She hugged me tight and marched over to Sarah's room. That's enough, I heard her shout. You will not treat your sister this way. But nothing changed. Sarah kept finding ways to remind me I didn't belong. And as we got older, it only got worse. As we grew older, my parents tried their best to keep the peace. They'd buy us the same clothes, give us equal gifts on holidays. But it was never enough for Sarah. Laura's sweater is softer, she'd complain. Or, her necklace has more jewels. You always give her the best stuff. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. In Sarah's mind, I was the favorite, the interloper stealing her rightful place. When I was about 10, my parents decided to sell the old house and buy a bigger one. I remember the day we moved in, how excited I was to have my own room. This is amazing, I squealed, twirling around the empty space. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face dark. Don't get too comfortable. This house belongs to me and Mom. You're just a guest here. I felt my stomach drop. Even in this new place, nothing had changed. Later that night, I heard Mom and Dad talking in hushed tones. I don't know what to do anymore, Mom sighed. I've tried everything with Sarah. Maybe we should take her to see someone, Dad suggested. A therapist or counselor? Mom agreed, and soon Sarah was going to weekly sessions. But if anything, it only made her more resentful. Oh, so now I'm crazy, she spat one day after a particularly rough appointment. You just want to fix me so precious Laura can have a perfect life. I wanted to scream that my life was far from perfect with her in it, but I kept my mouth shut. It never did any good to argue with Sarah. As the years went by, Sarah's victim complex only grew. Everything was someone else's fault, usually mine. She'd complain endlessly about how unfair her life was, how no one understood her. "You're all against me," she'd say. "You owe me for everything I've been through." I started avoiding her as much as possible, staying in my room or at friends' houses. Anything to escape the constant drama. When Sarah finally graduated high school and left for college in another city, it felt like the whole house breathed a collective sigh of relief. "Maybe some time away will do her good," Mom said hopefully. For the first time in years, I felt like I could relax in my own home. No more walking on eggshells, no more surprise attacks of Sarah's jealousy. Those 4 years while Sarah was away at college were the happiest of my young life. I threw myself into my studies, especially art and design. I'd spend hours sketching clothes, dreaming up new styles. Mom noticed my passion and started bringing home scraps of fabric from the factory for me to play with. "You've got a real talent, Laura," she'd say, admiring my creations. For once, I felt seen for who I was, not just as Sarah's annoying little sister. I started to imagine a future where I could use my skills, maybe even in the family business. After graduation, I'd been accepted to a college in another city to study design, which was a dream come true. The night before I left for college, Mom and Dad sat me down for a talk. "We're so proud of you, Laura," Mom said, her eyes misty. "You know we support your dreams, right?" I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. Dad chimed in. "We hope that after you graduate, you'll consider coming back to work with us. Your designs could really take the company to the next level." I promised to think about it, but honestly, I was eager to spread my wings. The idea of returning to my hometown, where Sarah's shadow still loomed, wasn't exactly appealing. College life was everything I'd hoped for and more. It was during my second year that I met him. Jason. He was a few years older, working on his master's in business. We bumped into each other at a campus coffee shop. Quite literally, I spilled my latte all over his shirt. We got to talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. Jason was funny, smart, and actually listened when I talked about my designs. We started dating soon after. As graduation approached, Jason and I talked about our future. We'd been together for over 2 years by then, and things were getting serious. "I've got a job lined up here in the city," he told me one night over dinner. "What do you think about staying here? Maybe, together?" My heart soared at the idea. I'd landed a position as a junior designer at an up-and-coming fashion company, and the thought of building a life with Jason away from all the family drama was incredibly tempting. But I knew I had to tell my parents face to face. So, we planned a trip back to my hometown. I was nervous about introducing Jason to my family, especially since I knew Sarah would be there too. To my surprise, the visit went better than I could have hoped. Mom and Dad loved Jason, and even Sarah was, well, not exactly warm, but at least civil. She didn't make any snide comments or try to undermine me, which was a first. Over dinner, I broke the news about my job and my plans to stay in the city. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said, but I could see a hint of disappointment in her eyes. Dad cleared his throat. "Actually, we had an idea we wanted to run by you. What if you opened a branch of our company in your city? You could be in charge of design, create your own line." I was stunned. It was a generous offer, one that would allow me to pursue my dreams while still being part of the family business. "Can I think about it?" I asked. They agreed, and the rest of the visit passed pleasantly. As Jason and I were leaving, Sarah pulled me aside. "Hey, I know things haven't always been great between us," she said, looking uncomfortable. "But I'd like to try and change that. Maybe I could visit you sometime?" I was skeptical, but nodded. "Sure, that'd be nice." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after Jason and I returned from my hometown. I threw myself into my new job, learning the ropes and impressing my bosses with my designs. Jason and I started talking about marriage, looking at apartments, dreaming of our future together. Everything seemed perfect. Then, about 3 months after our visit home, I got a surprise call from Sarah. "Hey, little sis," she said, sounding oddly cheerful. "I'm in town. Mind if I crash at your place for a bit?" I nearly dropped the phone in shock. Sarah, voluntarily coming to see me? It seemed too good to be true. But I remembered her olive branch from our last meeting and decided to give her a chance. When Sarah arrived, I barely recognized her. Gone was the scowling, resentful girl I'd grown up with. This Sarah was all smiles and hugs. Over dinner that first night, she dropped a bomb on me. "I've been thinking," she said, twirling pasta on her fork. "Why don't you come back home? We could work together at the family business. It'd be great." I nearly choked on my wine. "What? But I just started my job here. And Jason?" Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "Bring him along. There's plenty of opportunity back home." I shook my head. "Thanks, but no. Actually, Mom and Dad suggested I open a branch here. I'm still considering it." For a moment, I saw a flash of the old Sarah, a tightening around her eyes, a slight downturn of her mouth. But it passed so quickly, I thought I might have imagined it. "Well, if you won't come home, maybe I could stay here a while longer?" she asked. "We've got so much catching up to do." Against my better judgment, I agreed. And to my surprise, living with Sarah wasn't the nightmare I'd expected. She was helpful, even taking over most of the household chores. We'd stay up late, talking about our childhood, laughing over shared memories. It felt like I was finally getting the sister I'd always wanted. One night, over a bottle of wine, Sarah brought up the idea of us working together again. "What if we opened that branch together?" she suggested. "You handle the design, I'll do the business side. We'd make a great team." The idea was tempting. Despite our rocky past, Sarah and I had been getting along so well. And having her business acumen could really help get the new branch off the ground. "Let me think about it," I said, not wanting to commit just yet. As the weeks passed, Jason started coming over more often. At first, I was nervous about how he and Sarah would get along, given our history. But to my relief, they seemed to hit it off. I'd come home from work to find them laughing over inside jokes, or deep in discussion about some business concept. It warmed my heart to see two important people in my life getting along so well. Jason and I set a date for our wedding, just 6 months away. I designed the invitations, carefully curated the guest list, and agonized over every detail of the menu and decorations. Sarah was there every step of the way, offering suggestions and support. Meanwhile, Jason and I had decided to open the branch of my family's company after the wedding. Sarah and I spent many evenings discussing our plans, getting more excited with each conversation. "We're going to make an amazing team," Sarah said one night, clinking her wine glass against mine. 2 months before the big day, I was juggling work, wedding prep, and future business plans. Life was hectic, but wonderful. Then came the call that changed everything. "Laura, it's Dad," his voice sounded strained over the phone. "Your mother, she's not well. She's been feeling poorly for a while, but you know your mother, always putting on a brave face." He paused, and I could hear the worry in his silence. "I'm struggling to keep up with everything, the business, the house." I didn't hesitate. "I'm coming home. Right now." When I told Sarah, she sighed. "I wish I could come with you, but I've got some important meetings I can't reschedule." I was surprised by her reluctance, but didn't push it. "It's okay. I'll keep you updated." The situation at home was worse than I'd imagined. Mom looked pale and fragile, nothing like the vibrant woman I remembered. The doctor's diagnosis was devastating, a tumor, requiring immediate surgery. I threw myself into action, taking over household chores, helping Dad with the business where I could, and most importantly, being there for Mom. I arranged to work remotely, squeezing in design work between hospital visits and home care. The days blurred together in a haze of worry and exhaustion. But finally, there was good news. The surgery was successful, and Mom was recovering well. Through it all, I tried to stay connected with Jason. We'd video chat daily at first, his face a comforting presence on my screen. "How's your mom doing?" he'd ask, his brow furrowed with concern. "Better today," I'd reply, forcing a smile. "How are things there? Is Sarah behaving herself?" He'd laugh and assure me everything was fine, but as the days passed, our conversations grew shorter and less frequent. I told myself it was just the stress of the situation, that things would go back to normal once I returned home. But a month into my stay, the video calls stopped altogether. My messages went unanswered. The silence was deafening. The gnawing worry in my gut wouldn't let up. After days of unanswered calls and messages, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see Jason, to find out what was going on. I caught the next flight out, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Jason was sick. Maybe he'd lost his phone. Maybe. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. Some part of me wanted to surprise Jason, to see his face light up when he saw me. The silence that greeted me in my apartment was eerie. Then I heard it, a muffled giggle from the bedroom. Our bedroom. I wish I could say I hesitated, that I didn't barge in like some crazed person. But I did. And what I saw, God, I'll never forget it. Jason and Sarah. In our bed, naked and entwined. For a moment, the world stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then reality came crashing down. "What the hell?" I screamed, my voice breaking. They jumped apart, but neither looked particularly ashamed. If anything, they looked relieved. "Laura," Sarah said, wrapping the sheet around herself. "We didn't expect you back so soon." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You didn't expect? Are you kidding me? That's all you have to say?" Jason at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Sarah stood up, still clutching the sheet. "Look, sis, these things happen. Jason and we're in love." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "In love? You've known each other for what, a few months?" "Sometimes you just know," Jason said, reaching for Sarah's hand. "We didn't mean for this to happen, but..." "But what?" I interrupted. "You just accidentally fell into bed together?" Sarah smiled sweetly. "Laura, you should be happy for us. In fact, we were hoping you'd understand. Maybe even, let us use your wedding plans?" I stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" "Well, everything's already paid for," she explained, as if talking to a child. "It seems a shame to waste it. We could celebrate our engagement instead." I don't remember leaving the apartment. I don't remember the trip back to my parents' house. I just remember collapsing into my childhood bed, sobbing until I had no tears left. Mom and Dad found me like that. They didn't push, just sat with me until I was ready to talk. When I finally told them everything, Dad's face turned red with anger. Mom just looked sad. "I'll call her," Dad said, reaching for his phone. "This ends now." The conversation was short and brutal. I could hear Sarah's voice, shrill and defensive, through the speaker. "Of course you're taking her side," she yelled. "You always have." "Well, guess what? For once, I'm the one who got chosen." "How does it feel, Laura?" Dad's voice was cold. "Sarah, if you go through with this, you're no longer part of this family. Do you understand?" There was a pause, then Sarah's voice, dripping with venom. "Fine. I don't need you anyway. I've got Jason now." The line went dead. Mom pulled me into a hug, her still fragile body shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I clung to her, feeling like a little girl again. But I wasn't a little girl anymore. I was a woman who'd just had her heart ripped out by the two people she should have been able to trust most in the world. The days following the revelation of Sarah and Jason's betrayal passed in a blur. One moment, I'd be curled up in bed, unable to face the world. The next, I'd be researching lawyers, ready to sue them for every penny I'd spent on the wedding. It was during one of these angry research sessions that my phone rang. An unknown number. "Hello?" I answered warily. "Laura? It's Margaret, Jason's mother." I nearly hung up, but something in her voice stopped me. She sounded devastated. "I don't know what to say," Margaret continued. "We're so sorry, dear. So very sorry." I listened in stunned silence as she poured out her heart. How shocked and disappointed they were in Jason. How they'd always thought of me as a daughter. How they couldn't believe Sarah could do this to her own sister. "We want to make this right," Margaret said finally. "We know it won't fix everything, but we'd like to reimburse you for all the wedding expenses." True to their word, a check arrived a few days later, covering every last expense. It was a weight off my shoulders I hadn't even realized I was carrying. As the date of what would have been my wedding approached, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to the city, not yet. There were too many memories, too much pain. Would it be okay if I stayed here for a while? I asked Mom and Dad over dinner one night. Maybe work for the company? They exchanged a look, then Dad smiled. "We were hoping you'd say that. We could use your talents, especially in design." And just like that, I had a new direction. I threw myself into work with a fervor that surprised even me. Every sketch, every design, was a middle finger to Sarah and Jason. "Look what you gave up," I thought bitterly. "Look what you lost." The day of Sarah and Jason's wedding came and went. We didn't attend, of course. I spent the day locked in my office, working on a new line of youth clothing I'd been dreaming up. Months passed. My designs started gaining traction. The youth line was a hit, bringing in a whole new demographic of customers. Within a year, I'd helped increase the company's turnover by $1 million. Sarah and Jason? They were dead to me. I didn't think about them, didn't wonder what they were doing or if they were happy. They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. 3 years passed in a blur of fabric swatches, design meetings, and growing success. I'd thrown myself into work, using my pain as fuel to drive our family business to new heights. Our company had become a major player in the fashion industry, and I'd made a name for myself as an innovative designer. One balmy summer evening, I was having dinner with Mom and Dad at their place. We were laughing over some silly memory when the doorbell rang. Dad frowned. "Are we expecting anyone?" I shook my head, a strange feeling of unease settling in my stomach. Mom went to answer the door, and suddenly the air was filled with a voice I hadn't heard in years. Well, look at this cozy family dinner," Sarah sneered, pushing past Mom into the dining room. "Glad to see you're all doing so well without me." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" She looked different. Haggard, angry, with dark circles under her eyes. "Oh, just thought I'd drop by, see how the other half lives," she spat. "Especially now that I'm newly single." Dad's eyes narrowed. "What happened to Jason?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out, once a cheater, always a cheater. He left me for his secretary." Ironic, isn't it? I felt a twinge of something, not quite sympathy, but a grim satisfaction. Karma, indeed. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, not entirely truthfully. "But why are you here?" Sarah's face hardened. "I want what's mine. My share of the business. I'm family too, remember?" Dad stood up, his voice firm. "Sarah, you gave up any claim to this family and this business when you betrayed your sister. You're not getting anything. You can't do this," Sarah screamed, her composure cracking. "You can't just cut me out." Mom stepped forward, her voice soft but resolute. "We already have, Sarah. You're disinherited. Please leave." For a moment, I thought Sarah might lash out physically. But instead, she just glared at us all, her eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed, before storming out. A few days later, I was in my office when I heard a commotion from the lobby. I rushed down to find Sarah in the middle of our workspace, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You're all being deceived," she yelled at our bewildered employees. "My parents are unscrupulous liars. They've stolen what's rightfully mine." I didn't hesitate. I called the police, keeping my voice calm despite the chaos around me. "We need officers at Fashion Forward Designs immediately. We have an unstable individual causing a disturbance." Even as security tried to remove her, Sarah kept fighting. Over the next few days, she escalated her attacks, trying to break into our parents' house, smashing windows, and in a final, terrifying act, attempting to set fire to the front door. It was clear this couldn't go on. With heavy hearts, we took legal action, obtaining a restraining order that banned Sarah from approaching me, our parents, or any of our properties. As I sat in my office after the court hearing, looking out over the city I'd come to love, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for the sister I'd lost, anger at her actions, but also pride in how far I'd come. I was now a respected entrepreneur and fashion designer, my name known throughout the industry. Love? That could wait. The wounds from Jason's betrayal had healed, but I wasn't ready to risk my heart again. Not yet. For now, I was content to pour my passion into my designs, into building something lasting and beautiful. My name's Camilla, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes, the family you choose is more important than the one you're born into. Growing up, our house was always filled with the sound of my younger sister's laughter. Sarah was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Me? I was just there. I'd watch as Sarah pranced around the living room, putting on another impromptu fashion show for our doting parents. "I'm gonna be a famous model one day," she'd declare, striking a pose. Dad would clap enthusiastically. "That's my girl. You'll be on magazine covers before we know it." I'd roll my eyes and retreat to my room, burying my nose in a book about finance or economics. Even at a young age, I knew I wanted more out of life than just being pretty. As we grew older, the divide between Sarah and me only widened. She was all about partying and boys, while I focused on my studies. When it came time for college, I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would see the value in my hard work. "We'll pay for your first 2 years," Dad told me one night over dinner. "After that, you're on your own." I couldn't believe my ears. But what about Sarah? "Are you going to make her pay for her own education too?" Mom shot me a stern look. "Your sister has different talents. We need to support her dreams." I packed my bags and moved to another city for college. During the day, I threw myself into my studies, determined to become a financial analyst. At night, I worked whatever jobs I could find, waitressing, tutoring, you name it. Every penny I earned went into my savings for tuition. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I'd cry myself to sleep, exhausted and wondering if it was all worth it. But I refused to give up. I knew that education was my ticket to a better life, away from the constant comparisons and disappointments of my childhood home. By my 3rd year, I'd saved enough to cover my tuition. And for my final year? I hit the jackpot, a full scholarship based on my academic performance. Take that, Mom and Dad. Meanwhile, Sarah was living it up back home. She'd drop out of community college after a semester, claiming it was cramping her style. Last I heard, she was bouncing between modeling gigs and part-time jobs, still living in our parents' house. After graduation, I made the decision to stay in the city where I'd attended college. It felt more like home than my childhood house ever had. With my degree in finance and glowing recommendations from my professors, I landed a job at a prestigious firm. It wasn't entry-level either, they recognized my potential and gave me a position with real responsibility. I threw myself into work with the same determination I'd shown in college. Long nights, early mornings, whatever it took to prove myself. And prove myself I did. "Camilla, that deal you closed last week was impressive," my boss said one day, calling me into his office. "Keep this up, and you'll be looking at a promotion before you know it." I beamed with pride. This was what I'd worked so hard for, recognition based on my own merits, not comparisons to anyone else. It was around this time that I met Jake. We were both reaching for the same finance magazine at a local coffee shop, and our hands touched. Cliché, I know, but sometimes life really does play out like a rom-com. "Sorry," he said, flashing a warm smile. "You take it. I insist." "How about we share it over coffee?" I suggested, surprising myself with my boldness. That coffee date turned into dinner, which turned into weekend getaways, and before I knew it, 5 years had flown by. Jake was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: kind, ambitious, and supportive of my career. Meanwhile, my career flourished. Each successful deal brought bonuses and new opportunities. By the time I hit 32, I'd saved enough for a down payment on an apartment and bought myself a reliable car. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine, earned through my own sweat and tears. One night, over a homemade dinner in my apartment, Jake got down on one knee. As he slipped the ring on my finger, I couldn't help but think how different my life was now compared to my childhood. Here was someone who loved me for who I was, not who he wanted me to be. We decided to save up for a big wedding. After all, we'd both worked hard to get where we were, why not celebrate in style? "I want it to be perfect," I told Jake one evening as we scrolled through wedding websites. "A day that shows how far we've come." Jake squeezed my hand. "Whatever you want, love. You deserve it." I threw myself into wedding planning with the same enthusiasm I'd shown in my career. I subscribed to bridal magazines, joined online forums, and created mood boards. Every spare moment was spent dreaming up our perfect day. Meanwhile, life back in my hometown hadn't changed much. Sarah was still living with our parents, now with a baby in tow. The father, some guy she'd dated for a few months, had disappeared as soon as he'd heard the news. "Your sister needs our help," Mom said during one of our rare phone calls. "It's not easy being a single mother." I bit my tongue, holding back the retort that Sarah had made her own choices. Instead, I simply said, "I'm sure she'll figure it out." "That's the problem with you, Camilla," Mom sighed. "You've always been so cold towards your family." The accusation stung, but I refused to let it get to me. I'd spent too many years trying to win their approval. Now, I was focused on building my own life, my own family with Jake. One ordinary Tuesday, as I was reviewing some financial reports at work, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender's name made my heart skip a beat: Sarah. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, I opened it. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a scanned copy of our parents' will. As I skimmed through the legal jargon, one fact became crystal clear: Sarah was the sole heir to everything our parents owned. My hands shaking, I dialed my mother's number. She picked up on the third ring. "Mom, what's this will Sarah sent me?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why am I not included?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her tone was defensive. "Camilla, you're doing well for yourself. You have a good job, an apartment, a car. You don't need our money." "That's not the point," I argued, my voice rising. "I'm your daughter too. Don't I deserve?" "Your sister is struggling," Mom cut me off. "She's a single mother, she has no job. We can't leave her with nothing." The conversation went on like this for a while, with me trying to understand their decision and Mom defending it. In the end, I hung up feeling hurt, angry, and completely dismissed. Over the next few weeks, I distanced myself from my family. I stopped calling, stopped responding to messages. It hurt, but I told myself it was for the best. I had my own life now, my own family with Jake. I didn't need their approval anymore. But just as I was starting to feel at peace with my decision, life threw another curveball my way. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Jake and I were lounging on the couch, flipping through wedding venues online, when my phone rang. It was my mother again. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello?" "Camilla," my mother's voice was strained, almost panicked. "I need surgery. Urgently. The insurance won't cover it all, and we need money." I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what was coming next. "How much?" $22,000, she said quietly. The amount hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a large chunk of what Jake and I had saved for our wedding. I glanced at Jake, who was watching me with concern. I need to think about this," I told her. "I'll call you back." After I hung up, I filled Jake in on the situation. He listened thoughtfully, then said, "It's your decision, babe. But if it were my parents, I'd want to help." I nodded, torn between my lingering resentment and the desire to do the right thing. Finally, I called my mother back. "I can help," I said. "But I want to do this properly. I'll open a bank account and transfer the money there. You can pay me back gradually." To my surprise, my mother balked at the idea. No, we need cash." "Can you bring it in person?" Something about her insistence on cash set off alarm bells in my head. "Mom, I can't take time off work right now. But I can pay the hospital directly if you give me the details." "No," she said quickly. I don't understand all these modern banking things. Please, Camilla. Cash would be easiest." I was confused and a little suspicious, but I pushed those feelings aside. This was my mother's health we were talking about. "Okay," I said finally. "I can't come myself, but Jake can bring the money. Is that all right?" She agreed, and we made the arrangements. As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But I pushed those thoughts aside. After all, what could possibly go wrong? Jake left early the next morning, a briefcase containing $22,000 in cash securely tucked under his arm. I kissed him goodbye, a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I asked him to be careful and to call me as soon as he was done. He nodded, giving me a reassuring smile, promising he had everything under control. Hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake, informing me of his arrival. I held my breath, waiting for his call. When it finally came, Jake's voice was filled with a mix of emotions as he recounted the events of his visit. Upon arriving at my parents' house, Jake found that neither of my parents was home. Instead, he was greeted by my sister, Sarah. Jake explained the purpose of his visit, stating that he had brought money intended for my mother. Sarah informed him that our mother had been admitted to the hospital and our father had gone to visit her. She explained that they were borrowing this money to pay for our mother's operation. Despite the unexpected turn of events, Jake handed over the money to Sarah. After completing this task, he quickly excused himself and left. When Jake returned home, I was eager to hear about his trip. As he walked through the door, I rushed to greet him. "Thank you for doing this, Jake. I'm sure it will help my mom a lot." "There's something else," Jake added, looking a bit uncertain. Sarah wasn't alone in the house. There was a guy there, looked like he was living there. I blinked in surprise. A guy? Living there? Mom never mentioned Sarah had a boyfriend, let alone one who moved in. Jake shrugged. "Yeah, he seemed pretty comfortable. I was surprised too." I sat back, processing this new information. It was strange that my mother hadn't mentioned Sarah's boyfriend, but I brushed it off as just another example of our poor communication. "Well, I'm just glad we could help with Mom's operation," I said finally. "I hope she recovers quickly." As we sat there on the couch, I felt a mix of emotions. I was worried about my mother's health, but also grateful that we had been able to help. The presence of Sarah's boyfriend at my parents' house was unexpected, but I decided not to dwell on it. After all, my family's well-being was what mattered most right now. Every day, I'd call to check on my mother's progress, my heart racing each time until I heard her voice. "The operation went well, dear," she'd say, her tone reassuring. "We're so grateful for your help. I'm feeling better already." Relief washed over me with each call, but a nagging feeling persisted in the back of my mind. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. A month passed, and I decided it was time to see for myself how my mother was doing. I took some time off work and made the journey back to my childhood home. When I arrived, I was surprised to find my mother already up and about, looking normal. There were no visible signs of her recent surgery, no hints of the illness that had allegedly threatened her life just weeks ago. "Mom," I started, hesitantly. "How are you feeling after the operation?" She waved her hand dismissively, avoiding my gaze. "Oh, much better. No need to worry about all that now. Would you like some tea?" I wanted to press further, but seeing her bustling around the kitchen, I decided not to upset her. Maybe she just didn't want to relive the ordeal. My father was there too, doting on my young niece. Sarah, however, was conspicuously absent. "Where's Sarah?" I asked, watching my niece play with her toys. My mother's face lit up. "Oh, Sarah's doing so well. She's got a job now, can you believe it? Works 7 days a week, even spends some nights there. Such a hard worker, our Sarah." I couldn't hide my shock. This didn't sound like the sister I knew at all. "Wow, that's quite a change. People can surprise you," my mother said, a strange smile playing on her lips. "I spent 2 days with my parents, playing with my niece, and trying to reconnect with my family. But something felt off. There was an undercurrent of tension, whispered conversations that would stop when I entered the room. Finally, it was time for me to head back home. As I drove, my mind wandered, trying to make sense of the strange visit. On a whim, I pulled over at a rest stop and decided to check social media. I hadn't bothered in a while, given how distant I'd become from my family. As I scrolled through Sarah's profile, my heart stopped. There, in vibrant color, were photos of my sister in a white gown, beaming next to a man I recognized as the one Jake had seen at the house. The caption read, "Just married. Thanks Mom and Dad for the amazing wedding and dream honeymoon." The pieces suddenly fell into place with sickening clarity. The money, the rushed need for cash, the evasive answers about the operation. It had all been a lie. My vision blurred as the reality of the situation hit me. Without thinking, I flung open the car door and stumbled out, gasping for air. The cool breeze did little to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. Betrayal, anger, hurt, they all swirled together as I leaned against my car, trying to steady myself. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. Each ring felt like an eternity until finally, she answered. "Camilla? Is everything all right?" Her voice was casual, as if nothing was wrong. "Mom," I managed, my voice trembling. "I need you to be honest with me. What happened to the money we sent for your operation?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. "Camilla, you have to understand. There was no operation. We gave the money to Sarah for her wedding." The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. "How could you?" I whispered. "Your sister finally met a good man," my mother explained, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "We couldn't leave her without a proper wedding gift. This was her chance at happiness." Tears streamed down my face as I spoke. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked for that money? How many nights I stayed up, how many weekends I gave up? Jake and I were saving that for our own wedding." There was a moment of silence before my mother responded, her voice cold and indifferent. "You're smart, Camilla. You can always earn more." Her callous response sparked a fire of anger within me. "I want the money back," I demanded. "All of it, now." To my shock, my mother laughed. It was a harsh, mirthless sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, Camilla," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You can't prove you gave us any money." "What?" I gasped. "Jake brought it to you. He gave it to Sarah." "Did he now?" My mother's voice was sickeningly sweet. "That's not how I remember it. If you try to take this to court, I'll tell them your boyfriend is a fraud. That he took the money for himself and never gave us a cent. I felt like I was going to be sick. You wouldn't. Try me, she challenged. It's your word against ours, dear. And let's face it, who would believe a daughter who's barely spoken to her family in years over her poor, struggling sister and her devoted parents? Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone in disbelief, my mother's words echoing in my ears. The depth of their betrayal was staggering. Not only had they lied to me, stolen from me, but now they were threatening to paint Jake as a criminal if I tried to get the money back. I slumped against my car, my legs no longer able to support me. How had it come to this? My own family, the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, had manipulated and betrayed me in the worst possible way. I stumbled through our apartment door, emotionally drained and still reeling from the conversation with my mother. Jake was there in an instant, concern etched across his face. "Camilla, what happened?" he asked, guiding me to the couch. Through tears, I recounted everything, the wedding photos, the phone call, my mother's cruel words and threats. Jake listened intently, his arms around me, providing silent support. When I finished, Jake took a deep breath. "I had a feeling something wasn't right about that whole situation," he said softly. "That's why I took some precautions." Jake stood up and retrieved his laptop. "I bought a hidden camera before I went to your parents' house," he explained. "I had a hunch we might need proof of what happened." My eyes widened as Jake pulled up a video file. There on the screen was Jake, handing over the cash to Sarah. Clear as day, we could hear Sarah counting the money and stating it was for our mother's operation. "Jake," I whispered, "you're brilliant." He squeezed my hand. "With this, we can prove what really happened. Your mother can't deny it or threaten to accuse me of fraud." The next day, we met with a lawyer. After reviewing our evidence, she was confident we had a strong case. "It won't be a quick process," she warned us. "These things take time. But with this video, I believe we'll win." As we left the lawyer's office, Jake turned to me. "You know, we don't have to put our lives on hold while this plays out," he said. "Why don't we get married now?" I looked at him, surprised. "But what about the big wedding we were planning?" Jake shook his head. "That doesn't matter. What matters is us, starting our life together. We don't need a lavish party for that." Over the next few weeks, we planned a small, intimate ceremony. It wasn't the grand affair we'd originally envisioned, but as I stood there, exchanging vows with Jake surrounded by our closest friends, I realized this was perfect. There was a noticeable absence, my family. I hadn't called them, hadn't told them about the wedding. As much as it hurt, I knew it was for the best. As Jake and I shared our first dance as a married couple, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Yes, there was still a legal battle ahead, and the pain of my family's betrayal was still fresh. But here, in this moment, surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me, I felt hope for the future. Months passed, and our lawsuit against my mother finally went to court. As we presented our evidence, including Jake's video recording, I could see the shock and disbelief on the judge's face. My mother's attempts to paint us as liars crumbled in the face of irrefutable proof. The day the verdict was announced, my phone rang. It was my mother. "How dare you," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? You ungrateful child." I remained silent as she ranted, listing off every perceived sacrifice they'd made for me growing up. Her words, once capable of cutting me to the core, now felt hollow. "I hope you're happy," she spat. "As of this moment, you are no longer my daughter. You're dead to me." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling a mix of pain and, surprisingly, relief. The court ordered my mother to repay the $22,000. I later learned she had to take out a loan to cover it. Life moved on. Jake and I focused on our careers and our life together, leaving the drama of my family behind. But news still trickled in through mutual acquaintances. Sarah's marriage, it seemed, was far from the fairy tale she'd envisioned. She and her husband stayed with our parents, turning the house into a constant party zone. Neighbors complained about the noise and drunken behavior. It all came to a head when Sarah's husband, in a drunken rage, tried to kick my parents out of their own home. The police were called, and the ugly truth of their situation was laid bare for all to see. The final straw came when Sarah lost custody of her daughter due to her negligent behavior. My parents, finally seeing the destruction Sarah had wrought, kicked her and her husband out. They took in their granddaughter, determined to give her the stable home Sarah couldn't provide. Just when I thought that chapter of my life was closed for good, my phone rang with a familiar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Camilla?" My mother's voice was softer than I'd heard it in years. "I miss you." I said nothing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. "We need your help," she continued. "With raising your niece. It's hard, and we're not as young as we used to be." As she spoke, a sense of déjà vu washed over me. History was indeed repeating itself. Where once they'd favored Sarah over me, now they were trying to rope me into caring for her child. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice firm. "I can't help you." "But she's your niece," my mother protested. "Don't you care about family?" I took a deep breath. "My niece is innocent in all this, and I hope she has a good life. But you haven't changed. You're still trying to use me to fix your mistakes." "I won't do it. Don't call me again." I hung up and immediately blocked her number, along with those of my father and Sarah. As I set the phone down, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Jake found me on the balcony later that evening, staring out at the city lights. "Everything okay?" he asked, wrapping his arms around me. I leaned back into his embrace. "Yeah," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "I think it finally is." We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the pain, the betrayals, the hard lessons learned. But I also thought about the strength I'd found, the love I'd built with Jake, and the life we were creating together. My name's Grace, and I used to think I had it all figured out. A great job as head of marketing, a loving husband Mark, and a comfortable life. I was paying off our mortgage with my own salary, feeling pretty damn proud of myself for being financially independent. Family was a big part of our lives, too. Mark had a younger brother, Tom, and their mom, Linda, was always around. Their dad had passed away years ago, so the boys made it a point to look after her. I found it touching, honestly. It made me love Mark even more, seeing how he cared for his family. Linda seemed to like me well enough at first. We'd chat over coffee during family gatherings, and she'd always ask about my work. "Marketing, huh?" she'd say, nodding approvingly. "Sounds important." It felt good to have her approval. I wanted to fit in with Mark's family, to be part of their tight-knit group. Our first few years of marriage were filled with weekend barbecues, holiday dinners, and impromptu game nights with the extended family. I remember one Thanksgiving, all of us crammed around Linda's dining table, laughing and talking over each other. "Pass the gravy, will ya?" Mark's uncle bellowed from the end of the table. "You've had enough gravy, old man." Linda shot back, but she was grinning as she handed over the boat. I looked around the table, taking in the familiar faces, feeling a sense of belonging. This was my family now, too. The first cracks started to show during a New Year's Eve party at Linda's house. I was in the kitchen, refilling my glass of wine, when I overheard Linda talking to Mark and Tom in the living room. "Did you see what Carol's wearing?" Linda snickered. "That dress must have cost all of $5. I froze, my hand on the bottle. Carol was Mark's cousin, a single mom struggling to make ends meet. "I'm just saying," Linda continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Some people should know their limits. Don't try to play with the big boys if you can't keep up." I felt my cheeks burn with second-hand embarrassment. This wasn't the warm, welcoming family I thought I knew. I peeked around the corner, watching as Linda leaned in conspiratorially to her sons, all three of them giggling like schoolchildren. As time went on, I couldn't ignore the growing unease I felt around Linda. What I'd initially brushed off as harmless teasing started to look a lot more like meanness. And it wasn't just Carol who was in her crosshairs. At every family gathering, Linda would huddle with Mark and Tom, their heads close together as they whispered and snickered. Their eyes would dart around the room, landing on various relatives and friends, before they'd burst into muffled laughter. One Easter Sunday, I couldn't take it anymore. Linda was holding court in the living room, Mark and Tom flanking her like loyal subjects. "Did you see Janet's new car?" Linda was saying, her voice low, but not low enough. "Probably got it from the buy here pay here lot. I bet she'll be paying it off until she's 80. Before I knew what I was doing, I was on my feet, marching over to Linda's little group. "Hey," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Don't you think that's a bit much? Janet can probably hear you." The room went silent. Linda's eyes narrowed as she looked up at me. Well, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we've offended your delicate sensibilities, Grace." Mark and Tom exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I just think it's rude," I pressed on, my heart pounding. "Why do you always have to put people down?" Linda's fake smile disappeared. "If you don't like it, you don't have to listen. Why don't you go sit somewhere else?" I felt like I'd been slapped. I looked at Mark, expecting him to back me up, but he just stared at the floor. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. "I will." From that day on, family gatherings became a special kind of hell. I'd sit alone, nursing a drink, while Mark stuck to his mother's side like glue. He'd throw me apologetic glances now and then, but he never came to sit with me. "Why don't you ever stand up to her?" I asked him one night after a particularly awful dinner. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's my mother, Grace. What do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell her she's being cruel. I want you to have my back." But he never did. And slowly, I started finding reasons not to go to these family events. Work emergencies, migraines, anything to avoid the cold stares and whispered insults. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, life threw me another curveball. I was pregnant. I stared at the little plastic stick in my bathroom, my heart racing. 2 pink lines. Clear as day. "Mark," I called out, my voice shaky. "Can you come here?" He appeared in the doorway, his face concerned. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, I held out the test. His eyes widened as he took it from me. He pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, I felt like maybe everything would be okay. Maybe this baby would bring us closer together, heal the rifts that had been growing between us. But life had other plans. The pregnancy was rough from the start. Constant nausea, dizziness, and a perpetual threat of miscarriage kept me on edge. My doctor put me on bed rest, which meant working remotely. As the weeks went by, my condition worsened. My eyesight started to deteriorate rapidly, a rare complication that my doctor said could be temporary, but might also be permanent. Squinting at my laptop became impossible. With a heavy heart, I had to quit my job. I needed Mark more than ever, but he seemed to be drifting away. He'd come home late from work, citing extra projects or drinks with colleagues. More often than not, I'd fall asleep alone, the echo of the front door closing jolting me awake in the middle of the night. The day of my C-section arrived faster than I expected. My eyesight had worsened to the point where the doctors insisted on the procedure. Natural birth was just too risky. As I lay on the cold operating table, my heart raced with a mix of excitement and fear. "Where's Mark?" I asked the nurse, my voice trembling. She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Your husband's in the waiting room, dear. He said he'd rather stay there." The surgery went smoothly, and soon I heard the most beautiful sound, my son's first cry. As they placed him on my chest, I felt a rush of love so intense it took my breath away. Later, in the recovery room, Mark finally showed up. His face was a mask of discomfort and annoyance. "Look, Grace, I gotta say something. This whole thing? It's not right." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "Normal women give birth on their own, without all this surgery crap. And men? We're not supposed to be here for this. We should be meeting our wives and kids at home, like in the old days." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Mark, I couldn't risk." "Save it," he cut me off. "I'm heading home. This place gives me the creeps." The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Mark was rarely home, and when he was, he contributed nothing to our son's care. Instead, he'd complain constantly. "Can't you shut him up?" he'd growl as our baby cried in the middle of the night. "I'm trying," I'd say, exhaustion weighing heavily on me. "He's teething, Mark. It hurts him." But Mark had no patience for it. "All you do is focus on the kid. What about me, huh? What about our sex life?" I'd stare at him in disbelief. Here I was, running on 2 hours of sleep, still recovering from major surgery, and he was worried about sex. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's dissatisfaction grew. One evening, as I was trying to soothe our fussy 6-month-old, he dropped a bombshell. "You need to go back to work," he said flatly. I turned to him, shock written all over my face. "What? But the baby?" "We'll hire a nanny," he interrupted. "We can't keep living like this, Grace. We need the money." I wanted to argue, to tell him that our son needed me, that I wasn't ready. But the determined look in his eyes told me it was pointless. So, with a heavy heart, I started job hunting. Finding work with my compromised vision wasn't easy. I eventually landed a position at a smaller company, but the pay was less than what I'd earned before. When I told Mark, his reaction was predictably negative. "That's it?" he scoffed. "We're paying a nanny for this?" I felt tears pricking at my eyes. "I'm doing my best, Mark. It's not easy with my eyesight." "Excuses," he muttered, walking away. And so began my new reality, rushing to work each morning, guilt gnawing at me as I left my baby with the nanny, struggling through the day with my limited vision, then coming home to a resentful husband and a child who needed me. Time flew by in a haze of work, childcare, and mounting tension at home. Before I knew it, 2 years had passed since my son's birth. Despite the challenges, I loved him fiercely and found joy in his every milestone. Family gatherings remained a source of stress, particularly due to Linda's behavior. She'd sweep in, playing the doting grandmother for show, but her indifference was palpable. "Come to Grandma," she'd coo, arms outstretched to my son. But he'd cling to me, turning his face away from this unfamiliar woman. Linda's face would darken with anger. "What have you been telling him about me?" she'd hiss. "You're turning my own grandson against me." I'd try to explain, my voice tired. "He just doesn't know you well, Linda. If you visited more often." "Don't you dare blame this on me," she'd snap, stomping off to complain to Mark. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, my world tilted on its axis once again. I stared at the pregnancy test in my hand, my heart racing. Positive. I was pregnant. Again. Fear gripped me. My first pregnancy had been so difficult, my health so compromised. Could my body handle another? But as I calculated the weeks, I realized I was already well into the first trimester. The decision, it seemed, had been made for me. With shaking hands, I called Mark at work. "What is it?" he answered, his tone impatient. "Mark, I'm pregnant." There was a long pause. Then, "Look, Grace, I'm busy. We'll talk later. Just, don't quit your job, alright? We can't afford that." The line went dead. I sat there, phone in hand, feeling more alone than ever. Thankfully, this pregnancy proved easier than my first. My morning sickness was manageable, and my vision remained stable. I continued working, determined to provide for my growing family. But as my belly swelled, the distance between Mark and me seemed to grow exponentially. He spent more and more time at his mother's house, often not coming home until late at night. One evening, as I struggled to put our son to bed while balancing my swollen belly, Mark walked in. "Hey," I said, hopeful for some help. "Can you read him a story? I'm exhausted." Mark glanced at us, then at his watch. "Can't. I promised Mom I'd help her move some furniture." "Don't wait up." As the door closed behind him, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I looked at my son, his big eyes staring up at me trustingly, and at my rounded belly, home to a child I already loved fiercely. As my 7th month of pregnancy rolled around, I found myself preparing for Thanksgiving. Guests started arriving in the afternoon. My parents came early, my mom immediately rolling up her sleeves to help in the kitchen. Friends and relatives trickled in, filling our home with chatter and laughter. Just as I was about to serve dinner, the doorbell rang. It was Tom, Mark's younger brother, and to everyone's surprise, he had a woman with him. "Everyone, this is Melissa," Tom announced, beaming. "My fiancée." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in congratulations. I plastered on a smile, trying to ignore the twinge of jealousy at the way Mark's eyes lit up at the sight of his brother's happiness. Linda arrived shortly after, her eyes widening as she took in Melissa. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with approval. "Aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" Throughout dinner, Linda fawned over Melissa, peppering her with questions and hanging on her every word. I tried to focus on being a good hostess, but I couldn't help overhearing their conversation. "So, Melissa," Linda said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Tom tells me you're a manager at National Bank. How prestigious." Melissa nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Yes, I've been there for about 5 years now." Linda beamed. "You must be doing very well for yourself. Unlike some people who can only pop out babies and breed poverty," she added, throwing a pointed look in my direction. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. My mother tensed beside me, ready to speak up, but I placed a hand on her arm, silently pleading with her not to make a scene. "You know," Linda continued, her voice sickeningly sweet, "Melissa here makes $15,000 a month. Now that's the kind of daughter-in-law I've always dreamed of. Smart, beautiful, successful." Tears pricked at my eyes as I remembered the years I'd spent supporting our family, paying the mortgage, building a career I was proud of. All of that seemed forgotten now. "I think we should continue this lovely evening somewhere more suitable," Linda announced, standing up. "Melissa, dear, why don't we all go to that new restaurant downtown?" My treat, of course. Before I could process what was happening, Linda, Mark, Tom, and Melissa were heading for the door. Mark didn't even glance back at me as they left. The remaining guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the festive mood thoroughly ruined. One by one, they made their excuses and left, leaving only my parents behind. They offered to help me, but I refused, saying that they needed to rest themselves. Finally alone, I sank onto the couch and let the tears flow freely. Hours passed as I sobbed, my hand resting on my swollen belly, wondering how my life had come to this. It was nearly dawn when I heard the front door open. Mark stumbled in, reeking of alcohol and cigarette smoke. He didn't say a word as he made his way to the bedroom. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and opened social media. There they were, Linda, Mark, Tom, and Melissa, grinning for selfies at an expensive nightclub. The caption read, "Best Thanksgiving ever with my real family." As my due date approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The doctors had scheduled my C-section, insisting it was the safest option given that it had been less than 3 years since my last one. I tried to focus on preparing for our new arrival, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Mark. One chilly winter afternoon, I found him unpacking bags full of summer clothes. "What's all this?" I asked, puzzled. Mark shrugged, barely meeting my eyes. "Just saw a good sale. Thought I'd update my wardrobe." It didn't make sense, but with the impending birth occupying my thoughts, I pushed my suspicions aside. I'd been meticulously saving money in a separate account, determined to take a couple of months off work to recover and bond with the new baby. My workplace had approved 2 months of unpaid leave, which was a relief. I'd set aside enough for the mortgage, bills, and even a babysitter for our 3-year-old. For once, I felt prepared. 3 days before my scheduled C-section, chaos erupted. I was resting on the couch when Mark burst through the door, Linda hot on his heels. "Hurry up," Linda barked as Mark rushed to our bedroom. I struggled to my feet, waddling after them. Mark was throwing clothes into a suitcase, the summer clothes he'd bought. "Mark?" I said, my voice rising with panic. "What are you doing?" He barely glanced at me. "Tom's getting married in Hawaii. We're all going." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "What? But my C-section is in 3 days. Who's going to take care of our son?" Mark zipped up his suitcase, finally meeting my gaze with cold indifference. "You'll manage. You always do." Before I could respond, he brushed past me, Linda ushering him out. The door slammed, leaving me in stunned silence. Reality crashed over me like a tidal wave. I scrambled for my phone, hands shaking as I checked our joint account. Empty. All the money I'd saved, gone. With trembling fingers, I dialed Mark's number. He answered on the final ring. "What?" he snapped. "The money," I choked out. "All our savings. Where is it?" There was a pause, then a cold laugh. "We needed it for Tom's wedding gift. Don't be so greedy, Grace." The line went dead. A sharp pain lanced through my abdomen. I looked down in horror to see a puddle forming at my feet. My water had broken. Panic seized me. I couldn't go into labor now. The risk to my previous C-section scar was too great. With one hand on my belly and the other clutching my phone, I called emergency services. The hospital was chaos, doctors shouting, machines beeping. I woke hours later to the gentle beeping of monitors. My mother's tear-stained face swam into view. "Grace," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "You're okay. The baby's okay." Slowly, the fog lifted. I'd nearly died. My baby had nearly died. But we'd made it. 3 days after the emergency C-section, I was feeling surprisingly strong, both physically and emotionally. The doctors were pleased with my recovery and gave me the green light to go home. Mark hadn't called once since he'd left for Hawaii. Not to check if I was alive, not to ask about his new son. In that moment, I knew our marriage was over. I called my parents and asked to stay with them for a while. Their response was immediate and supportive. My parents doted on both boys, giving me time to rest and recover. I started researching divorce lawyers and gathering documentation of our finances. Then, exactly a week after I'd left the hospital, my phone rang. Mark's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail twice, before finally answering on the third call. "Where the hell are you? Why aren't you at home?" Mark's voice was a mixture of anger and confusion. I took a deep breath. "I'm at my parents', Mark. With both of our sons. I've filed for divorce." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a bark of laughter. "Divorce? Are you kidding me? After everything I've done for you?" "Everything you've done?" I felt a surge of anger. "You mean like abandoning me right before I gave birth? Or stealing all our savings?" "Oh, get over it," he scoffed. "I'll pay you back, no problem. In fact, I don't even want to see you again. You know why? Because I'm going to be rich." He launched into a tirade about how Tom's new wife had offered him a job as her deputy at the bank. How they were going to start their own financial company. How she was going to make them all wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. "You never believed in me, Grace," he spat. "You always shot down my ideas, always held me back. Well, guess what? I'm free now. And you? You're just a loser who can't see potential when it's right in front of her." The divorce proceedings moved quickly. To my surprise, Mark didn't contest anything. He returned the money he'd taken from our accounts and agreed to pay alimony. When it came to the house, I had years of mortgage statements proving I'd been the one making payments. The judge awarded it to me without hesitation. The day I returned to my house with the boys, Mark was there, packing up the last of his things. He sneered as I walked in, the baby in my arms and our toddler holding my hand. "Enjoy this dump while you can," he said, hefting a box. "I'll be in a mansion soon, swimming in cash. You'll see what you missed out on." As he walked out the door, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house suddenly felt bigger, brighter. A year and a half had passed since the divorce. Life had settled into a new normal for me and my boys. I'd returned to work, finding a balance between my career and motherhood. It wasn't always easy, but we were happy, healthy, and thriving. One ordinary Tuesday, my phone buzzed with a news alert. As I read the headline, my jaw dropped. "Local banker exposed as fraud, leaves family in ruins." The article detailed a shocking scandal. Melissa, Tom's wife, had been running an elaborate con. She'd convinced Mark, Tom, and Linda to take out massive loans to fund a non-existent financial company. They'd even mortgaged Linda's house, pouring every penny they had into this imaginary venture. But Melissa wasn't a banker at all. The office she'd shown them was a short-term rental, a prop in her elaborate scheme. She'd disappeared with millions, leaving behind a trail of forged documents and broken dreams. To make matters worse, I discovered they'd taken out an additional loan to fund Tom and Melissa's lavish Hawaiian wedding, the very event Mark had abandoned us for. As I read on, a mix of emotions washed over me. Shock, confusion, and, I'll admit, a twinge of satisfaction. The consequences were severe. Unable to repay their debts, they lost everything. Linda's house, their cars, even their personal belongings, all seized by creditors. They were left with nothing but mountains of debt. I heard through the grapevine that Linda had been forced to take a job as a cashier just to afford a tiny apartment and groceries. Mark and Tom were in similar straits, their dreams of wealth and success shattered. I was beyond grateful that I divorced Mark when I did. My children and I were safe, unaffected by the financial disaster that had befallen my ex-husband's family. Just when I thought I'd put it all behind me, my phone rang. Linda's number flashed on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Grace?" Linda's voice was small, a far cry from her usual imperious tone. We need your help." She launched into a plea, asking if they could stay with us. "The children need their father and grandmother," she insisted. "You can't leave family in trouble." I took a deep breath, memories flooding back, of Thanksgiving humiliation, of being abandoned before my C-section, of the countless times they'd belittled and dismissed me. "Family?" I said, my voice steady. "You weren't concerned about family when you left me alone, pregnant, and in danger. You weren't concerned about family when you stole my savings. You weren't concerned about family when you called me a loser." Linda started to protest, but I cut her off. "I'm sorry you're in this situation, Linda. But I'm not responsible for the choices you, Mark, and Tom made. My priority is my children, and I won't expose them to the chaos you've created. Please don't contact me again." I hung up, then immediately blocked her number. As I set down the phone, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was done. Truly done.